Hi, welcome to the fifth episode of U.S. History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering Chapter 5, the American Revolution. Let's get into it. We begin our story in June of 1776. The Continental Congress has chosen 5 men to write a formal Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson, with input from the other 4, writes the first draft of the document, and after some edits, he delivers it to Congress. On July 4th, Congress approves the final wording, and then one by one they sign their names to what amounts to a written admission of their intention to commit treason against the King of England. These men and the 13 states they represent have committed themselves fully and irreversibly to the fight for American independence. Now, if you've never actually read the Declaration of Independence, it's worth taking a second to do so. You can find the full text on Wikipedia, or there's a copy in the back of your textbook, and it's only about a page and a half long. Specifically, I want to highlight 2 sections. The first is the preamble, which includes by far the most famous line. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the high-minded philosophical part of the Revolution that we as Americans love to talk about. But if you read a little bit further, the Declaration of Independence quickly becomes a laundry list of 27 reasons why Congress was mad at King George III at the time, which conveniently for our purposes serves as a decent review of Chapter 4. I'll link to something in the description that goes into more detail about what each of these grievances means specifically, but essentially they boil down to the following. Number 1. Preventing the colonies from governing themselves. Number 2. Biasing the justice system toward Britain. Number 3. Sending royal agents and troops to enforce these laws. Number 4. Creating bad economic policies like mercantilism and taxation without representation. Number 5. Handling the rest of British North America unfairly. And number 6. Declaring war on the colonies and not fighting that war fairly. Now, that contrast between expressions of universal principles and complaints about specific policies is important because it reminds us that the motivation for the American Revolution was simultaneously ideological and also practical, tied to very specific circumstances that existed in the 1760s and 1770s. And that actually leads nicely into our next point. You see, we often imagine the Revolution as all of the Americans on one side and all of the British on the other side. But the reality is much more complicated, and therefore I think much more interesting. When the first shots of the war were fired in 1775, active support for independence was still a minority position. In the summer of that year, Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to London as a last-ditch effort to reach a peaceful settlement with King George. London responded by officially declaring the colonies to be in rebellion and enacting the Prohibitory Act, which blockaded the colonies to cut off all trade with the rest of the world. But even then, most Americans still weren't on board with independence. It wasn't until 1776 that the broad popular support the Revolution needed really started to materialize. In January of that year, Thomas Paine published his famous pamphlet Common Sense, which largely ignored the specifics of British policy and argued that basic reasoning was enough to justify American independence. And Paine actually took it a step further by arguing that the idea of monarchy itself was illegitimate. Quote, "In short, monarchy and succession have laid, not this or that kingdom only, but the world in blood and ashes. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived." And as a side note, Thomas Paine was actually even more radical than that. In 1775, he published an article calling for the abolition of slavery, and after this war, he became involved in the French Revolution as well. Anyway, Common Sense was ridiculously successful. Now, the revolution was finally starting to gain steam with the general populace, but because Congress was about as efficient then as they are now, it still took them another 6 months to formally declare independence. Not everyone was convinced by Common Sense, though. The AMSCO book estimates that maybe 40% of Americans actively supported the revolution, 20 to 30% actively supported the British, and the other 30 to 40% remained neutral. Now, back in Europe, the British government was understandably anti-independence, and that wouldn't really change until it became obvious that they weren't going to win the war. Meanwhile, the other European powers were watching from the sidelines. From the beginning, France and Spain provided secret small-scale aid to the revolution on the grounds that anything that was bad for Britain was good for them. But they wouldn't commit to anything official until the Americans could prove that they had a chance of actually winning. Now, there are two other groups that we need to mention here, and as an introduction to their relationship with this conflict, let's look back at the final grievance in the Declaration of Independence. King George has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Part of that is clearly talking about Native Americans. There were a couple of indigenous nations that sided with the Americans, but in general, the feeling was that if the Americans won the war, they would feel free to keep pushing further west and invading more Native American land. As a result, most indigenous nations that took a side in this war sided with the British. Now, did you catch the other group that's mentioned in that final grievance? It's intentionally subtle because even in 1776, people didn't like the idea of writing a document that included both the phrase, all men are created equal, and the word slave. But that first part about domestic insurrections is talking about uprisings by enslaved people. You see, in late 1775, the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation that offered freedom to any person enslaved by a rebel if that person would serve in the British Army. From this order, he raised a unit called Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, which consisted of black soldiers with white officers. Now, the British thought of Lord Dunmore's proclamation as a threat, the idea being that white Americans wouldn't dare oppose the crown if it might mean losing their enslaved workers. But in reality, Southerners saw this as an attack on the fabric of their society. To them, even making this offer was an admission that Britain was happy to create anarchy and burn the South to the ground as long as it meant that they could rule over whatever was left. Far from quashing support for the revolution, the threat of freeing black people from bondage actually drove more white Southerners to support independence. So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the actual war. Following the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, Patriot forces surrounded the British-held city of Boston. By the spring of 76, the British were forced to evacuate, and the Patriots, now under the command of George Washington, regained control of the city. Meanwhile, another American force invaded Canada, but they failed to either take Quebec by force or convince Canadian colonists to join the revolution. That concludes what your textbook calls the first phase of the war. On the American side, they had basically shown that they were capable of standing up to British troops, at least in limited numbers. However, the newly formed Continental Army was still trying to work through issues like where they were going to get their equipment from, and how Congress was even going to be able to pay them. These would be massive obstacles to the American cause throughout the war, and it wasn't clear yet that they would be up to the challenge. On the British side, they learned that this was an actual war, and they needed to respond to it with the full force of their army and navy, which in Phase 2 is exactly what they did. On July 3, 1776, the British General William Howe landed near New York City with an army of 32,000 men. Washington's army was completely overwhelmed. They spent most of the second half of the year retreating across Long Island, Manhattan, and eventually into New Jersey. Now, in the 18th century, wars typically got put on hold for the winter because the logistics of supplying an army become way harder when snow is potentially involved. The British followed this practice and settled into winter quarters, but on the American side, the army was already demoralized from a series of military defeats, and many of them were wondering if it wasn't just smarter to go home now before the British army could finish them off in the spring. With that in mind, Washington decided to make a gamble. On Christmas night, he led a small force across the Delaware River. The water was so icy and the visibility so bad that only half of Washington's men actually even made it to the other side. But he pressed on and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 prisoners along with a badly needed supply of ammunition. Afterwards, the Continental Army finally settled into their winter quarters with a renewed sense that there was some hope for victory after all. Now, in 1777, the British had a very specific plan. They believed that New England was the center of the revolution, so if they cut New England off from the other colonies, they could crush the rebellion there and then mop up whatever was left in the other colonies later. To accomplish this, British troops under General Howe would march north from New York City, while another army under General Burgoyne would march south from Canada and link up with Howe in Albany. Now, for reasons that I won't get into, General Howe abandoned the plan and attacked Philadelphia instead. General Burgoyne, on the other hand, followed through with the original plan, just without any possible support from General Howe. Burgoyne took Fort Ticonderoga in July and continued on towards Albany. Now, during this time, Burgoyne sent a diversionary force under Barry St. Ledger east through Haudenosaunee territory towards the American-held Fort Stanwix. Now, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, was made up of 6 nations that had agreed centuries earlier to work together on certain issues like foreign policy. In the case of the American Revolution, the Confederacy's official position was to stay neutral, but leaders from several individual nations decided to take matters into their own hands. In the Mohawk Nation, siblings Joseph and Molly Brant rallied support for the British, and Joseph actually led warriors in support of the British during this campaign. The Oneida Nation, on the other hand, sided with the Americans, and in fact, an Oneida woman named Two Kettles was actually the first one to alert the Patriots to the fact that the British were advancing on Fort Stanwix. She and her husband Han Yeri both fought on the Patriot side in the Battle of Oriskany, which the Americans won, but which had one of the highest casualty rates of the entire war, and which ultimately failed to break the British siege of Fort Stanwix. The other reason that this battle is important is that it marks the first time in centuries that Oneidas and Mohawks had killed each other on the battlefield. This internal conflict significantly weakened the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and later in the war, when the Americans launched reprisal attacks against the Mohawks and Senecas, many of them were forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in Canada. This essentially removed the Haudenosaunee as a major regional power and opened up their lands for white settlement after the war. If you're interested in a little bit more detail, I'll link to a video from the Oneida Nation in the description about their involvement in the war. Eventually, another American force under Benedict Arnold forced the British under St. Leger to withdraw and march back the way they'd come. Arnold's forces then headed east to link up with an army under Horatio Gates in time to contribute to the decisive Battle of Saratoga. Now, General Burgoyne had expected to receive support from both St. Leger and Howe at this point, but in reality he found his army completely on its own. American troops surrounded him, and on October 17, 1777, he was forced to surrender. The American victory at Saratoga is considered the turning point of the war because it marked the first time that an American army had scored a decisive battlefield victory against a large British force. The French took this as proof that the Americans really could win the war after all. They signed an official alliance in early 1778, and Spain followed suit in 79. The involvement of these European powers was critical for three reasons. First, they opened additional fronts in Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia that sucked up British resources that could have been sent to America. Second, the Europeans sent the Continental Army professional quality weapons and ammunition, which had always been in short supply up to this point. Third, France in particular actually committed troops and ships to the American theater, which would prove pivotal in the third phase of the war, as we'll see momentarily. However, before we get there, I want to touch on three specific things that happened with Washington's army in the winter of 77-78. While the Saratoga Campaign was happening, General Howe had taken Philadelphia, so Washington and his army chose to spend the winter at Valley Forge just outside the city. However, problems quickly started to pile up for the Americans. Congress had completely failed to provide adequate supplies for the army, and as a result, the troops found themselves wearing tattered clothes and struggling to find enough food to feed themselves. What's worse, a smallpox outbreak that had started back in 75 threatened the soldiers, who were especially vulnerable because of malnutrition. This brings us to the first point. In an effort to protect his men from disease, Washington ordered that everyone under his command be inoculated against smallpox. This was actually the second time he'd done this, and in both cases his army wound up stronger and healthier as a result. As a PSA, if you haven't gotten vaccinated yet and you have the opportunity, please do it. The second point regards the food. One of several groups that provided desperately needed supplies for the army was led by an Oneida woman named Polly Cooper, who brought thousands of pounds of corn to Valley Forge and then stayed on with the Continental Army as a cook. The third point is about the way troops were trained at Valley Forge. You see, the Americans had a well-established tradition of small organized militias, but in terms of full-scale armies, they were sort of making it up as they went along. That's where a man called Baron von Steuben comes in. There are three things you need to know about Baron von Steuben. He was Prussian, he was just about as openly gay as it was possible to be in 18th century America, and most importantly, he was an experienced professional military officer. Von Steuben transformed the Continental Army into a professional fighting force, and eventually codified this training into a manual, parts of which are still in use by the US Army today. As a side note, despite von Steuben's numerous contributions, it would remain illegal to be openly homosexual or bisexual in the United States military until 2011. The British, for their part, entered 1778 with a new strategy. With France fighting on the side of the Americans, the British could no longer afford to be spread out across the colonies like they were. They decided to shift their focus to the south, where loyalist sentiment was the strongest, re-establish order there, and then gradually push north. This begins what your textbook calls Phase 3 of the war. Now, the fighting in the south was different from the previous campaigns for a couple of reasons. First, loyalist sentiment was stronger here than in New York or Massachusetts, but patriot sentiment was still plenty strong. That meant that in addition to the Continental Army and the British Army, there were also numerous patriot and loyalist militia units that fought each other and pillaged the parts of the countryside that supported their respective enemies. Second, the American General Nathanael Greene adopted a strategy that relied on outmaneuvering the British and cutting them off from their supply lines, rather than engaging in a pitched battle like what we saw in the Saratoga Campaign. Third, the presence of the massive enslaved population in the South added an extra layer of complexity. Remember a second ago when I mentioned militia pillaging the countryside? Well, in the South, a lot of the property that they were pillaging was in the form of enslaved people. Both sides kidnapped enslaved people to either serve their troops or be sold off to buy more supplies, but the Americans actually took it a step further. Because state governments never had enough hard currency to actually pay their soldiers, Georgia and South Carolina both passed laws that provided an enlistment bonus in the form of enslaved people to anyone who volunteered for the Continental Army. We should note, however, that African Americans were not solely victims in this conflict. In fact, black people actually served in all three major Western armies in this war. The Americans kind of waffled back and forth about whether or not black men could enlist, but a few thousand did wind up fighting for the Patriot cause, including some in Rhode Island who were guaranteed their freedom in exchange for their service. The French army included a unit that they had recruited from their colony of Saint-Domingue in modern-day Haiti, which consisted of a few hundred mixed-race people of color. But both of these groups were dwarfed by the number of African Americans who served with the British Army, which probably numbered around 20,000. Earlier, I talked about Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which offered to grant freedom to enslaved people in Virginia who served in the British Army. In 1779, the British issued the Philipsburg Proclamation, which extended that offer to all of the colonies. And this time, there was actually a sizable British army there to flee to, so way more people had a chance to actually benefit from this offer, either by joining the British or by just escaping in the chaos and pursuing freedom on their own. Exact numbers are sort of hard to estimate, but all in all, we think somewhere between 80 and 100,000 enslaved people escaped from plantations during the war, including about a quarter of the enslaved population of South Carolina and about a third of the enslaved population of Georgia. Most of the black men who took advantage of this offer didn't actually serve in combat roles. They tended to serve as engineers, building fortifications and repairing wagons, or as guides, since they often knew their way around the countryside better than the British did. Also, although adult men made up most of these so-called black loyalists, this offer actually applied to women and children as well. Many black women found jobs as nurses, cooks, or laundrywomen, jobs which many white women also performed for the Continental Army. After several years of brutal fighting, the Americans and their French allies finally began to gain momentum in 1781. The British General Cornwallis retreated to the city of Yorktown, Virginia to resupply by sea. However, the French Navy managed to clear the British from the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's supply lines. A combined force of American and French ground forces surrounded the city and settled in for a 3-week-long siege. Now, during this time, Cornwallis's troops began to run out of food, as generally happens during a siege. To conserve his dwindling supplies, Cornwallis expelled all of the black people who had joined his army from the city. Somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 black men, women, and children were callously kicked out of fortifications that some of them had personally helped build, and they were sent back to the Americans, who placed them right back into bondage. The British supplies eventually ran out anyway, and Cornwallis finally agreed to surrender his army on October 19, 1781. The Battle of Yorktown did not totally end the war, but it did prove to the British government that they couldn't really win anymore. All that remained now was to negotiate the terms of the peace treaty. The negotiations stretched out about 2 years until all the warring nations reached a final agreement on September 3, 1783. The Treaty of Paris 1783 had the following relevant terms. Number 1, Britain would recognize the independence of the United States. Number 2, the boundaries of the United States would be Canada in the north, Florida in the south, and the Mississippi in the west. This is important because it includes the Ohio River Valley, which remember American colonists have been trying to settle since the French and Indian War decades earlier. Number 3, Britain would evacuate all of its troops from forts in U.S. territory. Now, one notable thing that's missing from this treaty was any agreement regarding the Native American nations that happened to live on the land that Britain had just handed over to the United States. Instead, the U.S. dealt with indigenous nations with separate treaties and, as we'll see later, separate wars. So, like we did last time with the French and Indian War, we ask ourselves, what were the consequences of all of that? How different was America in 1783 than it was in 1775? Well, the war had definitely revolutionized the top end of the American political hierarchy, as the removal of all British authority paved the way for the creation of a new national government and new state governments. However, once you step down past that level, a lot of society looked a lot like it did before. Talking about the social upheaval of the war, your textbook says, quote, "Those who had been wealthy at its beginning were, for the most part, still wealthy at the end. Most of those who had wielded social and political influence continued to wield it." That's not to say there weren't any changes, though. The removal of British mercantilist trading restrictions allowed American trade to expand both within the states and between the new nation and foreign countries. And in a more general sense, the revolution gave the United States the ability to make their own decisions about how to run their economy. This meant that when the Industrial Revolution took off in England in the following decades, Americans were able to follow suit and industrialize their own economy, rather than being forced to simply provide raw materials for British factories like Britain's colonies in Asia and Africa were. The role of women in society was not really revolutionized by the war, although there were those who believed that it should be. Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband John in 1776, quote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." What Abigail Adams wanted here was a liberalization of laws that gave husbands total control over their wives, for example, by preventing married women from owning property. In reality, most of these restrictions stayed in place, and some that did change actually became stricter. However, there was another front where Abigail Adams, along with the playwright Judith Sargent Murray, actually did make some headway: education. We'll talk about the details in Chapter 7, but essentially, Murray argued that women would be able to accomplish just as much as men if they were given equal access to education. On the religion front, the Revolution weakened the Anglican Church. Many Americans disliked the direct connection that it had to the British government, and on top of that, many Anglicans sided with the British in the war and wound up leaving the country after the Treaty of Paris was signed. And that brings us to the last social change I want to touch on here, which is emigration. Your textbook tells us that up to 100,000 loyalists left the country at the end of the war, which means that roughly 4% of the country just picked up and left. Scaled up for today's population, that's the equivalent of about 13 million people. We should also note here that many of the loyalists who left at the end of the war were black. Loyalist plantation owners took their enslaved laborers with them when they left, and on top of that, thousands of black people who had been freed by serving with the British Army left the country as well. There's a document called the Book of Negroes, which includes a list of about 3,000 newly freed black people who left New York City with the British at the end of the war. This list includes a man named Harry Washington, who was formerly enslaved by the American Commander-in-Chief George Washington. It's interesting to realize that those two men fought on opposite sides of this war, and both of them were fighting for their freedom. I mentioned earlier that each individual state created a new government during this period. They kind of had to because their previous governments were designed to function under British authority, and now each state was more or less designed to be its own independent nation. Now, these state constitutions varied, but in general, they all limited executive power and kept it separate from the legislature. These legislatures were less democratic than you might expect, though, because every state restricted voting to property owners, and many states had legislatures with upper houses that were specifically designed to represent the upper classes of society and exclude the lower classes. By the late 1780s, most states revised their constitutions to solve what they saw as a problem of too much democracy. That is, the legislature was too responsive to changes in people's moods to actually implement consistent policy. At least, that's the charitable interpretation of too much democracy. The cynical view is that rich people just didn't like the fact that larger groups of relatively poor people could make the government do things that help the poor and hurt the rich. In any case, states added upper houses and strengthened their executives to counteract the more populist parts of their new governments. And while we're here, there are two quick policy accomplishments that I want to touch on. Number one, states generally move towards religious tolerance. For example, Virginia passed the statute for establishing religious freedom drafted by Thomas Jefferson, which separated church and state and guaranteed Virginians the right to choose their own faith without coercion. Secondly, northern states began to abolish slavery starting in the 1780s, although it took New York and New Jersey until 1799 and 1804, respectively, to get on board with this. Let's talk quickly about the national government. The Articles of Confederation were sort of a rough draft of a national government. They had no real executive, and Congress had no power to force the states to actually do anything. This weakness was intentional. Americans were fighting against what they saw as an oppressive government, so it made sense to them to create a national government that couldn't possibly oppress them. However, this weakness also caused problems. For example, Congress wasn't allowed to tax people or draft people into the army, so if they needed resources to, fight a war or something like that, Congress basically just had to ask the states very nicely and hope that they agreed. Now, Congress did have the power to conduct foreign policy, which allowed them to negotiate the Treaty of Paris. The issue was that they weren't really powerful enough to force Britain to actually obey the treaty, so the British kept troops in all of those forts that they had promised to evacuate at the end of the war, which was a constant source of embarrassment for the new American government. The other issue where Congress had real authority had to do with the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. You see, one of the barriers to the states cooperating with each other in the first place was a series of disputes over who had claim to this land. The dispute would finally be resolved with states like New York and Virginia giving up their claims to the Ohio country and entrusting that land to the national government. This meant that Congress had the authority to decide how that land would be settled. To that end, they passed a series of laws that culminated with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The major points of these laws were as follows. Number 1, the land was organized as a single Northwest territory that could be broken up into separate states when a region reached a population of 60,000. Number 2, slavery was outlawed in this territory. Number 3, the land was divided into a grid of townships that were further divided into 36 individual square mile plots, which could be sold off in chunks as small as 40 acres. Congress set aside the revenue from selling one specific plot from each township to establish a public school. This grid system became the basis for how cities and towns would be organized throughout much of the American West. Number 4, the Northwest Ordinance specifically stated that property shouldn't be taken away from Native Americans without their consent, but realistically, Congress never enforced this. Settlers wound up doing what they usually did, which was taking whatever land they wanted and then fighting wars against any indigenous people who resisted. Speaking of which, several Native American nations like the Miami, the Shawnee, and the Lenape, whose lands were threatened by these waves of white settlers, united into what's called the Northwestern Confederacy in an attempt to push the Americans back east of the Ohio River. In 1791, the Miami leader Little Turtle won the most decisive victory that Native Americans would ever win against the United States Army at Wabash River. The Americans suffered a 97% casualty rate, but the war continued for another 4 years. Eventually, the U.S. would win a victory at Fallen Timbers and force the Confederacy to sign the Treaty of Greenville, which formally ceded most of modern-day Ohio to the United States. Now, there's one more topic that your textbook covers in this chapter, Shays Rebellion. At the end of the war, there was an economic depression, and things got really bad for poor farmers in the rural parts of New England. Merchants started to demand payment with hard currency, which we've noted didn't really exist in the United States at this time. To make matters worse, many Revolutionary War veterans had yet to see payment for their service, so they were forced to sell off their lands and property to pay back debt that they owed to these wealthy merchants in big cities like Boston. And as a final added burden, the state governments, which were generally run by those same wealthy merchants, had debts of their own, which they could only pay back by raising taxes. Rural farmers who were already struggling to make ends meet couldn't pay these increased taxes, so some of them chose to do something rather drastic. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, raised a militia in western Massachusetts to try to force the government in Boston to reduce taxes and grant debt relief. Shays and his men had some initial success, preventing the state from collecting taxes for a time, but in the end, a group of Boston merchants privately financed the state militia and used it to put down the rebellion. Consider for just a second the fact that Shays' position was essentially that the upper class was using their wealth and political power to oppress Westerners, and the upper class's response was to raise a private army to violently suppress dissent from Westerners. You can criticize Shays for using violence here, but it does seem like he had at least correctly identified a real problem facing their society. Eventually, the government of Massachusetts acknowledged some of that problem, pardoning Shays, reducing taxes, and offering a temporary postponement of debt payments. But the nation as a whole took a somewhat different lesson from this experience. You see, there was already a faction that believed that the Articles of Confederation were just never going to be good enough to establish an effective government. George Washington was one of those people, and he wrote a letter during this time to James Madison asking, "What stronger evidence can be given of the want of energy in our governments than these disorders? If there exists not a power to check them, what security has a man of life, liberty, or property?" To men like Washington and Madison, Shays' Rebellion was just further evidence that the nation desperately needed a newer, stronger form of central government. And in Chapter 6, we'll see exactly how they solved that problem. For now, though, let's move on to Part 2, what your textbook doesn't say. In this chapter, we talked about slavery during the Revolution, but I want to take a second to go into a little bit more detail about how the ideology of the Revolution influenced the way that people thought about slavery going forward, and how that differed between the North and the South. In 1780, Massachusetts ratified a new state constitution, and Article 1 of that constitution began with the words, "All men are born free and equal." An enslaved woman named Elizabeth heard the news about this new constitution, and she combined it with similar language in the Declaration of Independence to come to the conclusion that she should legally be free. She found a lawyer to represent her, she sued for her freedom, and in 1781 she won. Around the same time, a man named Quock Walker also sued his enslaver. That case made it before the Massachusetts State Supreme Court in 1783, where the Chief Justice said the following: "Slavery is, in my judgment, as effectively abolished as it can be, by the granting of rights and privileges wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence." In other words, by saying that all men are born free and equal, the new Constitution had effectively ended slavery in the state. Now that process makes sense to us today. If all men are created equal, then slavery is obviously wrong. Most northern states eventually came around to that line of thinking, but in the South they didn't, despite the fact that they had also signed the Declaration of Independence and fought a war for the same ideals, at least on paper. So why was that? Well, there's this concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. At a very basic level, that means that people feel uncomfortable when there's a contradiction between their beliefs and their behavior. At some level, there are sort of three things that you can do to resolve this contradiction. You can change the belief, you can change the behavior, or you can convince yourself that there really isn't a contradiction after all. In revolutionary America, people saw the contradiction between saying all men are created equal and then turning around and enslaving human beings. In places like Massachusetts, they changed their behavior and ended the practice of chattel slavery. In the South, however, they chose the third option and essentially convinced themselves that there was no contradiction, because black people were fundamentally less human than white people and therefore didn't deserve the same natural rights. In the wake of the Revolution, Southern states took colonial-era slave codes, like the ones that prevented enslaved people from learning to read or attend religious instruction, and updated them so that they covered free black and mixed-race children as well. The effect was, quote, to consign blacks to a morally and intellectually inferior status, and to give credence to the theory that there was a hierarchy of capability and attainment among the races. In other words, as long as Southerners could maintain a situation in which black people were denied opportunities to learn, they could convince themselves that black people were not capable of learning because they were fundamentally less intelligent and therefore undeserving of equal rights. At the same time, the Enlightenment focus on rational inquiry as a way of understanding the world motivated some Americans to look for scientific evidence of this supposed inferiority. For example, in Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson makes the following remark. To our reproach it must be said, that though for a century and a half we have had under our eyes the races of black and of red men, they have never yet been viewed by us as subjects of natural history. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. I think it's telling, though, that Jefferson follows this more evidence is needed disclaimer by saying that his suspicion of black inferiority is enough to justify maintaining slavery in order to prevent the mixing of the races, which he thinks might, quote, stain the blood of the master. Now, this was by no means the beginning of people using pseudoscience to justify a racist worldview, but it does help us understand the rise of so-called scientific racism in the United States in the 19th century. Ultimately, my point here is that the revolution meant something different to different people. Many people in the North eventually got to the point where slavery was seen as a betrayal of revolutionary ideals, a betrayal of what America was supposed to stand for. But in the South, the revolution was always seen as a white man's revolution. And rather than seeing slavery as a betrayal of revolutionary ideals, they viewed abolition as an assault on their property rights. From their point of view, that was exactly the sort of tyranny that they had been rebelling against. For now, these differences could be ignored because each state was basically an independent nation, and they could all make their own laws on the subject. But over the next century, as the United States moved closer and closer to really being a singular, unified country, the issue of slavery was going to have to be resolved, one way or the other. That brings us to part 3. What does this have to do with modern life? In this episode, we discussed some of the founding fathers of the United States, people like George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. You may have noticed that in addition to talking about their achievements, I've also criticized all three of these men, either in this episode or in previous ones. I want to take a second to talk about why I do that, and why I think that being willing to discuss the failings of the founding fathers can help us in modern life as well. You see, a lot of times when the founding fathers come up in general conversation in the United States, we act like they were these perfect, angelic beings who descended from the heavens to rescue us from tyranny. But in reality, all of these men were just human beings. And the thing about human beings is that sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we ignore problems that we could have fixed if we were willing to put in the effort. And sometimes we make selfish decisions that hurt the people around us. The founding fathers did all of these things too. We just usually either ignore them or excuse them. The problem is that ignoring their faults creates blind spots that prevent us from understanding how our world got to be the way it is. And excusing their faults is even worse because it not only creates those blind spots, it also sometimes teaches us things that aren't true. Let me give you 2 examples of how engaging with criticism of the founders can help us out today. Number 1. Immigration is one of the most controversial topics in modern American politics, and it turns out that's nothing new. It's been one of the major topics of discussion for all of our history. For example, here's an excerpt from something Benjamin Franklin wrote about immigration in the early 1750s. Why should German immigrants be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? So essentially, what Franklin is saying is immigrants are going to come, they're not going to learn our language, they're not going to act like us, they're going to turn our country into something different from what it is now, and I don't like that. You'll note that if you replace German immigrants with Latin American migrants or Middle Eastern refugees, this is pretty similar to some of the arguments you hear today. The difference is that Franklin made this argument 270 years ago, so it's pretty easy for us to fact check him. It turns out, if you go to Philadelphia, you'll notice that the entire city hasn't been converted into a beer garden / pretzel factory, and the vast majority of people who live there speak English and not German. Franklin was verifiably wrong about this. His fear was overblown, and the same is true for a lot of the fear around immigration today. Now for the second example. The easiest and most common criticism of George Washington is that he was the most influential person in the entire country, and he never used that influence to do or say anything publicly about slavery. Now, because this criticism is so common, there's a fairly standard excuse as well. It was the 1700s. There wasn't really anything anyone could do about slavery at that point. But earlier in this video, we noted that Thomas Paine wrote an article speaking out against slavery in 1775, and we talked about how people like Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker forced Massachusetts to live up to its commitments about equality and eliminate slavery in the state in the 1780s. Far from living in a time when nothing could be done about slavery, Washington lived at a time when people already were doing something about slavery. He just wasn't one of them. So the next excuse is, of course, oh, come on. If Washington had tried to abolish slavery when he was president, the South would have just rebelled. But this is what I was talking about earlier when I said that these excuses can sometimes teach us things that aren't true. You see, there's an assumption in that excuse, which is essentially that when it comes to major social issues, we should look for solutions that one powerful person can implement by themselves with no negative consequences. And if we can't find a solution like that, it's fine to just give up and go do something else. The problem is, that's not how social changes happen. What really happens is that a bunch of people spend a bunch of time educating the people around them about the problem and how it needs to be fixed. Then those people work together to push for change, usually locally and gradually at first, until they build up enough momentum to justify sweeping nationwide change. Following the abolition movement from these very early seeds gives us a roadmap for how we can start moving towards positive change in our own society today. Not by waiting for a hero like George Washington to just swoop in and fix the whole thing for us, but by educating ourselves and organizing with like-minded individuals who are willing to put in the work to move the ball forward, even if it's only a little bit at a time. Well, that's it for Chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, etc. Otherwise, we'll be back for Chapter 6, The Constitution and the New Republic, in which George Washington warns us about the dangers of partisan politics, and the rest of us spend 225 years kind of acting like we didn't hear him say that.